Two men held my arms while a third pressed something cold against my neck. I did not agree to this. Nobody had asked me a single question that mattered. By the time the drug wore off, Earth was a small blue stone behind a wall of black glass, and I was sitting in a metal chair that did not belong to any country I recognized. My name is Daniel Hartley. 6 months ago, I was stacking boxes in a warehouse outside Denver and arguing with a landlord about late rent. Now I was strapped into a transport ship heading toward a war I had never asked to join, on behalf of people who were not even human. The Severine Compact arrived on Earth 2 years before that night. They came with ships the size of small cities and a simple offer: protection from a war already happening somewhere far away in exchange for resources, technology sharing, and soldiers. Governments signed the agreement before most people finished reading the headlines. Nobody voted on it. Nobody got a say. The compact called it a partnership. What it actually meant was a quota. Every nation on Earth had to provide a set number of bodies for the war effort, and those nations were free to choose how they filled it. Some used volunteers. Most used debt. I owed money. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough that when the contract collectors came to my door, with a compact uniform already folded over one arm, refusing was not really an option anyone gave me. My brother Ryan had volunteered the year before, hoping the signing bonus would clear our family's debt before it buried us. He shipped out with a recruiter's smile and came home in a box too small to hold what was left of him. Nobody at the funeral could tell us how he died. Compact regulations, they said. Classified. I was not given the same choice he had been given. I was given a needle and a transport seat. The cabin around me hummed with a sound I had never heard before, something between a heartbeat and a generator. Across from me sat a row of others, men and women I had never met, all wearing the same gray fatigues, all blinking against the same fading effects of whatever they had used to keep us calm during processing. Most of them looked the way I felt, confused, furious, trying very hard not to show either. A woman with short dark hair sat 2 seats down, gripping the edge of her restraints so hard her knuckles had gone pale. She caught me watching and managed a tight, humorless smile. "First time flying?" she asked. "First time being kidnapped," I said. She laughed, short and sharp, the kind of laugh that comes out before a person decides whether laughing is allowed. "Grace," she said. "Sutton, in case anyone asks. Daniel Hartley. Well, Daniel Hartley, welcome to the rest of our lives." Before I could answer, a voice filled the cabin, not from speakers exactly, but from somewhere inside the walls themselves, vibrating through the metal seats and into our spines. It spoke English, though the rhythm was wrong, every sentence landing half a beat off from where a human voice would place it. "Cargo designation Earth Battalion 4-2. You have been selected for service under the Severine Compact Defense Initiative. Compliance ensures survival. Resistance ensures termination of contract." Termination of contract. I noticed nobody bothered translating what that word actually meant. Nobody needed to. The ship shuddered as it broke from Earth's gravity, and through a narrow window across the cabin, I watched my planet shrink into something small enough to cover with one thumb. I thought about my mother, who did not yet know I was gone, who would find out from a letter stamped with a seal she had never seen before. I thought about Ryan, and the box that had come home instead of him, and how nobody had been brave enough to tell us what was inside it. Grace was still watching me. "You've got the look," she said. "What look?" "The one where a person decides whether they're going to survive this, or just exist through it." She shrugged. "I had it about an hour ago. Which one did you pick?" "Ask me again when we land." The journey took 11 days, though days meant nothing in a ship with no sun. We spent most of it being processed, which was the compact's polite word for being measured, scanned, tagged, and sorted like livestock at auction. Aliens moved through our holding bay in tall robes that shimmered faintly even under flat light, their faces narrow and angular, their eyes too large and too still. They spoke to handlers, never to us, as if we were equipment that occasionally needed adjustment. One of them, a thin figure with pale gray skin and a voice like wind through a metal pipe, paused in front of me longer than the others had. He held a thin device that hummed against my chest, reading something only he could see. Designation: Hartley, Daniel, he said. Sibling record found. Terminated unit: Hartley Ryan. Cause of termination: combat failure. His name was Ryan, I said, not a unit. The alien tilted his head slightly, the way a bird does when it hears a sound it cannot place. He did not respond. He simply made a note on his device and moved to the next person in line, as if I had said nothing at all. That was the first time I understood something the Compact did not seem to know about us. They had not come to Earth looking for individuals. They had come looking for a resource, predictable and replaceable, the same as the soldiers they recruited from a dozen other worlds. Obedient, disposable, quiet when they died. They had no idea what they were actually bringing home with them. By the time the ship reached its destination, a sprawling station built into the curve of a ringed planet none of us had names for, the handlers had sorted us into units of 12. My unit included Grace, a quiet man named Noah Whitfield who barely spoke unless spoken to, and a sharp-eyed young man named Lucas Bennett who, within the first hour, had already made 3 jokes I was not allowed to laugh at, and one I could not stop thinking about. "You ever notice," Lucas said, as we were marched through a corridor lined with alien guards twice our height, "that they keep calling this an opportunity, like we applied for an internship and not a war?" "Keep your voice down," Grace muttered. "Why? They don't even understand sarcasm. I tested it on the intake officer, told her I was thrilled to be here. She wrote down thrilled like it was a medical condition. Despite everything, I almost laughed. It surprised me that something in me could still find room for that, 12 hours after watching my planet disappear behind glass. We were led into a massive hall where hundreds of soldiers from a dozen different species stood in rigid formation, waiting for an orientation none of us understood yet. Above us, projected onto a curved ceiling taller than any building I had ever stood inside, was a single image, a star map, marked with a long red line that stretched from a cluster of unfamiliar systems toward a name none of us recognized. Korathi Front. A voice, the same flat alien rhythm from the transport ship, echoed through the hall. "You have been brought here to serve. You will be trained to follow command without hesitation. You will be assigned to combat units within 20 standard days. Compliance ensures survival." I looked at Grace. I looked at Lucas, who had gone quiet for the first time since I had met him, and at Noah, whose jaw was tight enough to crack a tooth. None of us said anything. We did not know yet what the Compact actually expected from us. We did not know that the obedience they wanted from human soldiers, the same obedience every other species in that hall had learned to give without question, was something we were never built to offer. After more standing in formation than any of us had ever endured, we were marched to a wing of the station built specifically for human use, complete with artificial gravity, calibrated to Earth standard, and lighting that mimicked daylight on a 24-hour cycle. It was, the handlers explained without irony, designed for our comfort. Our barracks held 40 bunks in 2 rows, all metal, all identical, with a single locker beside each one. Lucas claimed the bunk beside mine before anyone could argue, dropping his single-issued bag onto the frame, like he was staking territory on a map. "Better view from here," he said. "It's a wall," I said. "Best wall in the building." A woman entered the barracks before I could respond, and the room went quiet in a way the Compact announcements had never managed. She wore a uniform like ours, gray and unmarked, but carried herself like someone who had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. Dark hair pulled back tight, eyes that moved across the room and catalogued every person in it within seconds. "My name is Captain Elena Brooks," she said. "I have been on this station for 3 years. I am, as far as the Compact is concerned, a model human soldier. I am telling you that so you understand something important. I am also the only person in this room who can tell you the truth before someone else buries it." Nobody moved. "They are going to train you to be obedient," Brooks continued. "They are going to tell you obedience keeps you alive. In my experience, obedience keeps you breathing a little longer before you become a number in someone else's report. I am not telling you to disobey orders. I am telling you to keep something of yourselves in reserve, whatever that something is. Do not let them train it out of you. Why? Grace asked. What happens if they do? Brooke studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that weighed how much truth a person could carry without breaking under it. Then you stop being useful to anyone, including yourself, she said. Get some rest. Training starts in 6 hours, and they do not wait for tired soldiers to catch up. She left as quietly as she had entered, and the room stayed silent long after the door closed behind her. I lay on my bunk that night, staring at a ceiling that was not really a ceiling, somewhere inside a station orbiting a planet I would never be able to point to on any map, light years from a mother who still did not know I was gone. I thought about Ryan, about the box that came home too small and too quiet, about a single phrase, combat failure, that had explained nothing and meant everything. Whatever the compact thought they were building with us, I had a feeling they were about to get something else entirely. Something they had not measured for, had not trained for, had not left a line item for in any of their reports. I just did not know yet how right I was. An alarm tore through the barracks before my eyes had even adjusted to the dark, a sound built to shred sleep rather than end it. Lights snapped on white and merciless. A voice from the walls counted down from 60, and somewhere down the row, Lucas was already swearing as he yanked his boots on with one hand and his jacket with the other. 60 seconds to formation, the voice repeated. Failure to comply results in point deduction. None of us knew yet what points meant or why we should care, but 6 hours of sleep and a station full of armed aliens had taught us not to ask questions before we understood the cost of asking. We ran. The training yard was a flat gray field the size of several football stadiums stitched together, ringed by towers where handlers watched through glass that caught no reflection. 40 of us stood gasping in 2 uneven lines, while a Severine officer paced in front of us, his robes catching the wind in a way that looked almost peaceful, completely at odds with the words coming out of him. "You are the slowest cohort processed this cycle," he said. "Slowness costs lives in the field. Slowness costs resources in training. You will learn speed, or speed will be removed as a variable." Lucas leaned toward me without moving his head. Did he just threaten to remove our legs? "Don't test it," I muttered. The officer's name, as far as any of us could tell, was something our mouths were not built to pronounce, so the handlers simply called him Director Velkar, and the title stuck faster than any of us expected. Velkar ran us through drills that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with obedience. Stand here, move there, hold position until told otherwise, even as your legs shook and your knees buckled and the cold air turned your breath to fog in front of your face. It was on the 3rd day that things started to go wrong, in a way none of the handlers seemed prepared for. We were running a simulation, a massive holographic battlefield projected across the training yard, designed to mimic the kind of urban combat the compact expected us to face on the Karathi front. Buildings that were not really buildings rose around us. Streets that were not really streets stretched in every direction, and somewhere in that maze, hidden enemies waited to test our reflexes. The rules were simple. Hold the position. Defend the marked perimeter. If a squadmate fell, the simulation marked them as terminated, and the exercise continued without them. We were told, very clearly, not to break formation for fallen soldiers. The objective was the perimeter, not the person. Grace was 20 feet to my left when the simulated fire hit her, a burst of red light that the system registered as a fatal wound. She dropped to one knee, then to the ground, and the holographic display above the yard flashed her name in a harsh clinical red. I broke formation before I had decided to. I do not remember choosing to run toward her instead of holding the perimeter. My body simply did it, the way a hand pulls back from a flame before the mind finishes registering heat. Lucas was already moving too, cutting across the field at an angle that made no tactical sense, abandoning the position we had been ordered to hold for a person the simulation had already declared dead. "She's terminated," a voice barked through the field speakers. "Return to position. Return to position immediately." Neither of us stopped. By the time we reached her, 3 more squad mates had broken away from their own positions, drawn toward the same red flashing name, like the simulation's failure had become a kind of gravity none of us could resist. The perimeter, predictably, collapsed. The simulation ended in failure, every screen across the yard flashing the same message in stark white letters: "Objective not achieved." Director Velkar walked the length of the field in silence, his expression, if it could even be called that, unreadable beneath skin that did not move the way human faces move. He stopped in front of me, then Lucas, then the others who had broken formation, studying each of us like specimens under glass. "You were told the objective," he said. "You were told the unit designated Sutton was terminated. Explain this deviation." I did not have an answer that would make sense to him. I am not sure I had an answer that made sense to me. "She's my squad mate," I said. "Terminated doesn't mean abandoned." Velkar tilted his head, the same small motion the alien on the transport ship had made when I told him Ryan had a name instead of a designation. It was not confusion exactly. It was closer to a creature trying to process a sound that did not belong to any language it had been built to understand. "This unit's training metrics will reflect a critical failure," he said, and moved on without another word, already speaking into a device clipped to his robes, reporting something none of us were allowed to hear. That night, in the barracks, Lucas dropped onto his bunk and stared at the ceiling for a long time before he spoke. "You think they're going to punish us for that?" he asked. "Probably. Worth it." I did not argue, because some part of me agreed with him in a way I could not fully explain, not even to myself. Grace sat on the edge of her own bunk across the aisle, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the two of us with an expression that had not fully settled into anything yet. "I'm not actually dead, you know," she said. "It was a simulation. You could have just left me there and finished the exercise." "We know," Lucas said. "Then why didn't you?" Nobody answered her right away, because none of us had a clean answer to give. Noah, who rarely spoke unless the silence had gone on too long for even him to bear, finally broke it from his bunk near the far wall. "Because leaving you there would have meant something," he said, "even if it was fake, even if the only thing it cost us was a training score." Grace did not respond to that, but she did not look away from him either, and something about the way she finally let her shoulders drop told me she understood exactly what he meant, even if none of us were ready to say it out loud. The pattern repeated itself over the following days, in ways that began to draw attention far beyond Director Velkar's training yard. In a simulated retreat exercise, where we were ordered to fall back and abandon a wounded squad mate to slow pursuing forces, 3 separate human units refused the order outright, choosing instead to carry their wounded through exit points the simulation had not accounted for. In a resource scarcity drill, where units were expected to compete against each other for limited supplies, human squads began trading and sharing instead, undermining a system built entirely around scarcity, creating obedience through desperation. Every other species training alongside us seemed to follow the rules exactly as written. A squad of Threlian soldiers, tall and silent, executed every retreat order without hesitation, leaving wounded behind without so much as a backward glance. Their efficiency rated highest among all cohorts on the station. A unit of Korvath fighters, built low and broad with skin like cracked stone, abandoned a teammate during a resource drill without a flicker of objection, citing protocol in a tone that suggested the question itself was strange to them. One of the Threlian soldiers approached me after that retreat exercise, moving with the same careful stillness all of them carried, as if every motion had been measured before it happened. Up close, his skin had a faint blue sheen under the artificial light, and his eyes carried no white at all, just deep black centers that made it impossible to guess where he was actually looking. "You carried the wounded one through the side exit," he said, in a voice flattened by a translator clipped near his throat. "The simulation marked that path as compromised. Casualties there would have counted against your unit twice." "I know," I said. "Then why?" It was not really a question, more a sound shaped like one. The way Velkar's silences had never quite landed as confusion either. I thought about how to answer in a way that might actually reach him, because leaving him on the marked path felt like agreeing he was already gone, I said, and he wasn't gone yet. The Threlian studied me for a long moment, head tilted at an angle that human necks were not built to copy. Our training teaches that hesitation kills units. Sentiment is hesitation. Maybe, I said, or maybe sentiment is the reason somebody comes back for you when the exit you're standing on stops being marked safe. He did not answer that, and I never learned his name before he turned and walked back toward his own formation, but I noticed him watching our unit more closely during the drills that followed, the way someone studies a puzzle they were not given the right pieces to fully solve. Word of these small, strange refusals moved through the station faster than any of us expected. A handler from the Resource Scarcity Division pulled 4 separate human squads aside for what she called a clarification briefing, attempting to explain, with visible strain in her translated voice, that competition for limited supplies was meant to simulate real battlefield conditions, where sharing meant both units starved instead of one surviving. Then both units starve, Lucas told her flatly, when it was our turn in front of her. Beats deciding which 12 people get to live, based on who grabbed the crate first. The handler made a note, the same way Velkar always made notes, a small gesture that had started to feel less like documentation and more like a creature filing away a mystery it did not yet have the tools to open. We were, by every metric the compact cared about, performing worse than almost anyone else on the station. And yet something was happening that none of their metrics were designed to measure. Captain Brooks found me alone in the mess hall on the 7th day, sitting in front of a tray of food that resembled nothing I had ever eaten on Earth, technically nutritious and completely without flavor. She sat down across from me without asking, the way someone does when they already know the answer would not matter. "You broke formation in the urban simulation," she said. It was not a question. Word travels fast. On a station with no privacy and very curious handlers, yes. She studied me for a moment. Velkar filed a report. Wanted you flagged as a discipline risk. My stomach dropped somewhere. It had not dropped since the needle in my neck. And the report got buried under 11 other reports about 11 other squads doing exactly the same thing. Brooks leaned back slightly. "You're not a discipline risk, Hartley. None of you are. You're a pattern, and the compact does not know what to do with patterns they did not design." "What does that mean for us?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I've watched a dozen species pass through this station in 3 years. None of them broke formation for a teammate the simulation had already marked dead. None of them shared resources they were told to compete for. The handlers built every system here assuming obedience is the strongest instinct any soldier carries." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "They didn't account for the fact that some of you might carry something stronger." "Like what?" Brooks looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time since I had met her, something in her composed expression cracked just slightly, enough to let a flicker of something older and more tired show through. "I had a brother too," she said. 3 years ago. Different war, same compact contract. I know exactly what it looks like when someone runs toward a person instead of holding a position they were ordered to hold." She stood, gathering her tray. "Whatever it is, Hartley, do not let them train it out of you. They are very good at training things out of people. It is the one thing this station does better than almost anything else." She left before I could ask what had happened to her brother, and something told me asking would not have gotten me an answer anyway. 2 days later, on the morning of our 20th day on the station, every barracks across the human wing received the same notice at once, displayed in flat red text on every wall screen simultaneously. "Deployment orders issued. Human Battalion 4-2 assigned to active combat zone, Korathi Front. Effective immediate transport. Effective immediate transport. Not effective tomorrow. Not effective after further training. Immediate." Lucas read the notice over my shoulder, and for the first time since the shuttle had pulled away from Earth, he did not have a joke ready. "That's fast," he said quietly, "even for them." "Maybe they don't think we need more training," I said. "Or maybe," Grace said, appearing behind us with Noah close at her side, her eyes fixed on the screen with an expression I had not seen on her before, somewhere between fear and something sharper. "They want to see what we actually do when the simulation stops being a simulation." None of us had an answer for that. We packed what little we had been issued, checked weapons we had barely learned to fire, and reported to the transport bay before the sun, if this station could even be said to have one, had finished rising. Whatever the compact thought they understood about us after 20 days of broken formations and shared rations, they were about to find out how little of it applied once real fire started cutting through real air, and real names stopped being numbers on a simulation screen. I did not know it yet, standing in that transport bay with Grace on one side and Lucas on the other, but the war was about to teach the compact something far more important than anything their training program had managed to measure. It was about to teach them what we actually were. The drop pod hit ground hard enough to crack my teeth together, and the door blew open before I had finished bracing for impact. Outside was smoke, orange light, and a sound I would spend the rest of my life trying to forget. A high, constant whine that I would later learn was the sound Korathi weapons made when they tore through the air looking for something to hit. "Move, move, move," someone was shouting, and it took me a full second to realize the voice belonged to me. We came down in a valley. The briefing maps had labeled a forward staging zone, a flat stretch of cracked gray stone, surrounded by ridgelines on 3 sides. The plan, delivered to us 6 hours earlier by Director Velkar in his usual flat rhythm, had been simple. Hold the staging zone, wait for the main compact force to arrive, do not advance beyond the marked perimeter under any circumstances. The Korathi had apparently not read the same plan. They came over the eastern ridge before our boots had even settled into the dust, dozens of armored shapes moving with a speed that made the simulations back on the station look like slow-motion footage. Their weapons fired in bursts of pale green light that left scorch marks the size of dinner plates in the stone around us. Beside me, Lucas dropped flat without being told, dragging me down with him a half-second before a burst of green fire passed through the space my head had just occupied. "Welcome to the war," he said, breathless, pressed into the dirt beside me. There was no time to answer him. The staging zone, the one we had been ordered to hold and not leave, was already collapsing under fire from 3 directions at once. Our sergeant, a broad-shouldered man named Owen Park, who had survived 2 previous deployments and rarely let anyone forget it, was shouting orders that the chaos around us was swallowing before they reached half the squad. "Hold position!" Park bellowed. "Hold the line, do not advance." I do not know exactly when the line stopped meaning anything. Somewhere in the noise and the smoke, I watched Grace go forward instead of back, dragging a wounded squad mate from another unit toward what little cover the staging zone still offered. I watched Noah move with her, covering her retreat with steady, controlled fire that did more to slow the Korathi advance than anything the official plan had accounted for. I watched the line we had been ordered to hold simply stop existing, replaced by something closer to a current, pulling every human soldier in the valley toward whoever needed help most in that exact moment. It should have gotten us all killed. By every rule the compact had drilled into us, it should have gotten us all killed. Instead, the Korathi advance began to falter. They had clearly trained against forces that behaved predictably, units that held fixed positions and reacted to pressure the way every other compact species had been taught to react, falling back in clean, orderly lines that could be flanked and broken apart with mathematical precision. They had not trained against soldiers who abandoned their assigned positions to save a stranger, who advanced instead of retreating simply because retreating meant leaving someone behind, who turned a battlefield into something closer to chaos than strategy and somehow survived it anyway. I found myself moving forward with the others, weapon raised, following Lucas through a gap between 2 burning supply crates that the official map had never marked as a route. Smoke stung my eyes. The whine of Korathi fire filled every direction at once, and somewhere underneath the noise, I could hear someone screaming in a language I did not recognize, high and desperate in a way that needed no translation at all. The screaming was coming from a Severine officer. He had fallen near the center of the staging zone, pinned beneath debris from a collapsed supply tower, his pale robes already dark with something I did not want to look at too closely. He was not human. He was not even from a species that had been particularly kind to us during processing, the same kind of cold, clinical official who had once called my brother a terminated unit instead of a person with a name. Every part of the Compact's training had taught us he was not our priority. Hold the perimeter. The objective was the position, not the person. I went to him anyway. I do not remember deciding to. My body simply moved, the same way it had moved toward Grace in the training simulation, the same way Lucas had moved without hesitation toward a wounded man on a marked path that was supposed to mean abandonment. Fury carried me there more than courage did, a hot, focused anger at the idea that anyone, alien or human, should be left to die alone under a pile of broken metal while soldiers nearby debated whether saving him was tactically efficient. The debris was heavier than it looked. I got my shoulder under one edge and heaved, feeling something in my back protest violently, and Lucas appeared beside me a heartbeat later, adding his own weight to the effort without a word. Between the two of us, we shifted enough of the wreckage for the officer to drag himself free, gasping, one arm clearly broken, his large dark eyes fixed on me with an expression I had never seen on a Severine face before. It was not gratitude exactly. It was closer to disbelief. "You are not assigned to my unit," he managed, voice thin with pain. "No," I said. "Then why?" There was that question again, the same one the Threlian soldier had asked back on the station, the same question the Compact's entire system seemed built around, as if the answer should have been obvious to anyone capable of basic logic. Why help a person who offers you nothing in return? Why spend resources on someone outside your assigned unit? Why risk a position for a stranger? I did not have a clean answer for him either, not in that moment, with green fire cutting through the smoke around us and the whine of Korathi weapons still tearing through the valley. I just knew that leaving him there had never actually felt like an option, not for one single second, no matter what the staging plan said about priorities. "Because you were screaming," I said, "and nobody else was coming." Before he could respond, the whine of incoming fire sharpened into something closer, and I shoved him toward what remained of the supply crates without thinking, throwing myself flat as a burst of green light tore through the space where we had just been standing. The heat of it passed close enough to singe the edge of my jacket sleeve, and for a moment, the entire world narrowed down to the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and furious in my ears. That was when I saw him. A Korathi soldier had broken through the smoke less than 20 feet away, weapon already rising toward where Lucas knelt over the fallen officer, exposed and unaware. I do not remember raising my own weapon. I do not remember the decision to fire, the way I had not remembered the decision to run toward Grace, or the decision to run toward the screaming officer pinned under broken metal. There was simply the weapon in my hands, and the shape rising through the smoke, and Lucas kneeling in its path with no idea how close he was to never standing up again. I fired before the thought fully formed. The shape staggered and went down, and the whine of its weapon cut off mid-rise, and for one long, suspended moment, the noise of the battlefield seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the sound of my own breathing, ragged and uneven, and a silence inside my chest that felt heavier than anything the fighting around me had managed to produce. It was not clean. None of the training simulations had prepared me for how it would actually feel, the way a single action could be both completely necessary and completely unbearable at the exact same time, the way relief and horror could occupy the same breath without canceling each other out. I had no time to process any of it. The battle did not pause to let me. Lucas was already pulling me back toward cover, shouting something I could not fully hear over the ringing in my ears, and the Severine officer was being half carried, half dragged toward the same shelter by Grace and Noah, who had appeared from somewhere in the chaos exactly when they were needed. The fighting did not end there. If anything, The next stretch of minutes felt longer than everything that had come before it, stretched thin by adrenaline and the strange, narrow focus that takes over when survival becomes the only thought a person has room for. A second wave of Korathi soldiers pushed through the western edge of the staging zone, forcing what remained of our unit into the skeleton of a collapsed supply structure, half its roof torn away by earlier fire, the other half threatening to come down on top of us with every fresh impact outside. It was inside that structure that we found a soldier from a different human unit, a young woman with a wounded leg who had been separated from her squad during the initial chaos and left behind when her own line had been forced to fall back. She was pressed into a corner, weapon raised with shaking hands, clearly expecting to be facing Korathi soldiers instead of 3 exhausted humans and a wounded Severine officer stumbling through the doorway behind us. "I'm not compact infantry," she said quickly, voice cracking. "I'm not part of your unit. I got cut off. I didn't mean to." "Doesn't matter," Grace cut in, already moving toward her, checking the wound on her leg with quick, practiced hands. "You're not staying here alone." Nobody questioned it. Nobody asked whether helping her fit the mission parameters, or whether her unit designation matched ours, or whether the staging plan accounted for stragglers separated from other squads. Noah took position at the doorway, covering the approach with the same steady, economical fire he had shown earlier, while Lucas helped Grace get the wounded woman onto her feet, and I kept my eyes on the officer, who was watching all of it unfold with an expression that had stopped looking like disbelief and started looking like something closer to study, as if he were memorizing the shape of a question he had never thought to ask before. We moved as a group through the wreckage, 6 of us now instead of 4, covering each other through gaps in the smoke that had no place on any official map of the staging zone, until we reached a stretch of fallen stone solid enough to offer real cover. It was there, crouched behind broken rock with green fire still streaking overhead, that the second wave finally began to break against reinforcements arriving from the ridge behind us. Compact gunships descending in formation heavy enough to scatter the remaining Korathi soldiers within minutes. We held what remained of the staging zone for almost 20 more minutes before the main compact force finally arrived, scattering the Korathi advance with reinforcements heavy enough to end the engagement decisively. By the time the smoke began to clear and the medical teams moved in to collect the wounded, the valley looked less like a battlefield and more like the aftermath of something that had no clean name. Sergeant Park found me sitting against a scorched supply crate, weapons still in my lap, hands that would not quite stop shaking no matter how hard I pressed them flat against my knees. "You broke formation," he said, not unkindly, lowering himself onto the ground beside me with the careful movements of a man who had been fighting wars long enough to know exhaustion when it hit. "I know. You went after a Severine officer who wasn't part of our unit, in the middle of active fire, against every standing order we'd been given." "I know that, too." Park was quiet for a moment, studying the wreckage around us, the scattered shapes of fallen Korathi soldiers, the medical teams working in tight, efficient circles around the wounded. "You also probably saved his life, and Bennett's, in about the same 30 seconds. I did not have anything to say to that. The shaking in my hands had not stopped, and somewhere underneath the exhaustion settling into my bones, I could still feel the weight of the moment my weapon had fired, a weight I suspected was never going to fully lift, no matter how many more battles followed this one. "For what it's worth," Park added, standing slowly, brushing dust from his knees, "the compact is going to call what happened out here today a critical breakdown in tactical discipline. I've already seen the preliminary assessment forms. I think they're wrong. I think what happened out here today is the only reason most of this unit is still breathing." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me alone with the wreckage, the fading whine of distant weapons fire, and a silence inside my chest that no after-action report would ever be able to properly describe. A medic moved through the wreckage not long after Park walked away, kneeling in front of me with the brisk efficiency of someone who had treated more shaking hands than she could probably count. She introduced herself as Mia Ashford, wrapping a strip of synthetic gauze around a cut on my forearm I had not even noticed until she pointed it out. "You're not actually hurt. she said, checking my eyes for something I assumed was shock. Not in any way I can bandage, anyway. Feels like it, I admitted. That part doesn't get a dressing. She tied off the gauze and sat back on her heels, glancing toward the far end of the wreckage, where the Severine officer was being treated by a compact medical team, his broken arm now sealed in a thin silver brace. He asked about you, before they sedated him for transport. Asked what? Your name. She shrugged, standing, already moving toward the next wounded soldier waiting for her attention. Didn't expect that from one of them. Figured it might matter to you. It did, more than I wanted to admit out loud. Before the medical team carried him toward the waiting transport, the officer caught my eye across the wreckage and managed a weak, deliberate nod, the kind of gesture that needed no translator clipped to anyone's throat to understand. Vren Kell, he said, voice still thin with pain but steady enough to carry. That is my name, not a designation. I understood exactly what he meant by that, and something in my chest loosened slightly for the first time since the drop pod had hit the ground. Daniel Hartley, I said. He held my gaze a moment longer, then let the medical team carry him away, and I was left sitting in the wreckage with a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling somewhere underneath the exhaustion, something that almost resembled hope, fragile and unfamiliar in a place built entirely around quotas and termination reports. Lucas found me a few minutes later, settling onto the ground beside me without a word, his usual stream of jokes nowhere to be found for the first time since I had met him. We sat together in the wreckage of a valley that had not officially belonged to either of us an hour earlier, and neither of us said anything for a long time, because some things, I was beginning to understand, did not actually need to be said out loud to be carried. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the rest of the war was still waiting, and we had only just begun to understand what the compact had actually brought across the stars when they decided Earth's debt could be paid in soldiers. They had wanted obedient bodies to fill a quota. What they had gotten instead was about to become very, very difficult to explain in any report. 2 armed escorts pulled me out of the mess hall without explanation 11 days after the staging zone, marching me down a corridor I had never been cleared to enter, toward a door that hissed open onto a room with no windows and exactly 1 chair. My stomach had already dropped somewhere past my boots before either escort said a single word. Sit, one of them said, in the same flat translated rhythm every Severine voice seemed to share. Director Velkar will arrive shortly. I sat. Nobody had told me whether I was about to be commended or court-martialed, and the not knowing was worse than either outcome would have been on its own. I thought about the staging zone, about Vren Kell pinned under broken metal, about the Karathi soldier who had not gotten back up after I fired. I thought about Ryan and combat failure and wondered for one cold moment whether this room was where the compact quietly removed soldiers who had stopped fitting the shape they were built for. Velkar entered without announcing himself, robes settling around him as he took the seat across from me, a thin device already humming in his long fingers. He studied me for a long moment before speaking, the silence stretching far past the point where any human officer would have filled it. Your unit's performance at the staging zone has been reviewed, he said finally. Casualty reduction exceeded projections by a margin no prior cohort has matched. Officer Vren Kell has filed a formal commendation. I waited for the rest, certain it was coming, certain the commendation was only the polite half of whatever this meeting actually was. Your discipline metrics remain critically low, Velkar continued. Formation deviation, order deviation, resource sharing in violation of standard protocol. He set the device down. By every standard the compact uses to measure a soldier, your unit should not function, and yet it survived an engagement that 3 other units of comparable size did not. So which is it, I asked, commendation or court-martial? Something in his expression shifted, not quite an emotion I recognized, but close enough to unsettle me regardless. Neither, he said. You are being promoted. Effective immediately, you will assume command of your unit. Sergeant Park sustained injuries during the staging zone engagement that preclude further field service. The news landed harder than I expected. a quiet blow underneath the relief of not being court-martialed. Park had walked away from that valley on his own 2 feet. I had not realized how much damage had been hiding underneath that. "He's not dying," Velkar added, apparently reading something in my face even his translator could not fully account for. "He is being reassigned to training command. You will take his place in the field." I left that room with a new rank I had not asked for, and a weight in my chest that felt heavier than the one I had carried out of the staging zone, and it did not take long to understand why the compact had moved so quickly to put me in charge of people who had already started following me without any rank attached to the decision at all. Word of the staging zone had spread through the station faster than any official report could have managed on its own. I noticed it first in small things, the way Threlian soldiers in the mess hall glanced toward our table and then quickly away, the way a Korvath commander rerouted his unit's training schedule to avoid overlapping with ours entirely. Lucas noticed it too, and being Lucas, he could not let it pass without comment. "I think we're famous," he said, watching a pair of Threlian officers leave the mess hall the moment we sat down. "Or radioactive. Hard to tell which with these guys." "Probably both," Grace said. It was Vren Kell, recovering in the station's medical wing with his arm still sealed in its thin silver brace, who finally gave the rumors a shape I could understand. He requested to see me directly, an unusual enough event that the guards outside his recovery room actually checked my identification twice before letting me through. "They are afraid of you," he said, without preamble, the moment the door closed behind me. "Not afraid in the way soldiers fear an enemy, afraid in the way one fears something it cannot predict." "We saved your life," I said. "Doesn't seem like something to be afraid of." That is precisely the part they cannot reconcile. Vren Kell shifted slightly against his medical bedding, wincing at the movement. "Every species in this compact operates on a foundation of predictable self-interest. A unit holds a position because holding it serves the unit. A soldier abandons the wounded because the wounded no longer serve the mission. It is not cruelty, Hartley, it is architecture. Remove the structure, and the entire system becomes unstable. And we're the instability. You are soldiers who run toward danger for someone outside your own designation, who share resources designed to create scarcity, who treat a stranger's survival as though it were your own." He held my gaze with those large, dark eyes that had stopped looking unreadable to me somewhere back in that valley. "I do not have a category for that. Neither does the compact's training architecture. It is, I believe, the reason they are now requesting your battalion be deployed at greater distances from Allied units in future engagements. They want us further away. They want to study what you are doing without risking exposure to whatever is causing it." A faint, almost human attempt at dry humor crossed his face, awkward in its construction, but unmistakable in its intent. "I told them it is likely incurable." Despite everything, I laughed, short and surprised, and Vren Kell tilted his head in that same small motion I had seen a dozen times now, no longer confusion, just the particular satisfaction of a joke landing somewhere it was meant to land. A week after the staging zone, Captain Brooks pulled me aside following a routine briefing and told me, in a voice pitched low enough that the nearest handler could not have overheard, that a closed session of the Compact Strategy Council had spent nearly 2 hours discussing human battalions specifically. She had not been allowed inside, but a Thralian liaison sympathetic to humans had given her the shape of it afterward. They debated 3 options, she said: disband the human program entirely and absorb the existing soldiers into other species units, restrict human deployment to logistics and rear support only, or continue frontline deployment but isolate human battalions from joint operations wherever possible. Which one won? The third, Brooks said. For now, the casualty numbers are too good for them to walk away from outright, and the Karathi front is bleeding the compact dry on every other species' soldiers. But they are scared, Hartley. Scared enough that 2 separate delegates suggested classifying whatever is happening with human units as a contained variable rather than a tactical advantage. A contained variable. Something to be managed, not something to be replicated. Brooke studied me for a moment, the same weighing look she had given Grace back on the first night in the barracks. They don't want more of you. They want to understand what they already have, keep it useful, and make absolutely certain it never spreads to anyone else's training program. I thought about Vrenkel's word for it, architecture, and how frightened a species could become when something walked straight through a structure they had spent generations building, without even seeming to notice the walls were there. What happens if they can't contain it? I asked. Brooks did not have an answer for that, and the not knowing sat with me for the rest of that day, heavier than any of the casualty reports I had read since taking command. 3 days later, my unit was assigned to a reconnaissance mission along a contested supply corridor, our first deployment under my new command, and it was there that I learned exactly how heavy that command actually was. We were moving through a narrow pass when Korathi scouts caught our flank, and in the scramble to break contact, Noah took a hit that dropped him hard against the rock, his leg buckling beneath him in a way that told me immediately he was not getting up on his own. The corridor behind us was collapsing under pursuit. The extraction point was 400 meters ahead, through terrain that offered no cover for anyone moving slower than a full sprint. Park's training, Velkar's training, every compact protocol drilled into us during those 20 days on the station. All of it agreed on exactly one course of action. Leave him. Lay down covering fire, get the rest of the unit to the extraction point, send a medical team back once the corridor was secure. I gave the order. Bennett, Sutton, get him under cover and hold, I said, voice somehow steady, despite everything happening inside my chest. The rest of you, with me, we draw them toward the ridge and buy Noah time. It was not abandonment. I told myself that with every step away from him, every burst of return fire I directed toward the pursuing Korathi scouts to pull their attention off the narrow gap where Lucas and Grace had dragged Noah behind a fallen slab of rock. It was tactics. It was the only version of the plan that gave all 4 of us a real chance at surviving the next 10 minutes. It still felt like something breaking. Something hot and familiar rose up through my chest as we drew the scouts further along the ridge, a fury I recognized from the staging zone, the same fury that had carried me toward Vrenkel under that collapsed supply tower. This time it had nowhere productive to go, no debris to lift, no clean target to aim it at, beyond the Korathi soldiers already in my sights. I let it carry me anyway, channeling it into precision instead of panic, into the kind of steady, controlled fire that gave Lucas and Grace exactly the window they needed to get Noah stabilized and moving. The anger was not new. It was, I realized somewhere in the middle of that ridge, an old and familiar visitor, the same thing that had carried me through Ryan's funeral without breaking down in front of people who needed me steady, the same thing that had carried me onto that transport ship without giving the men dragging me a single tear to feel satisfied about. It rushed through me now, sweet in a way anger should never have felt, a known and steadying thing in a moment that should have shattered me completely. We reached the extraction point with 4 minutes to spare, Noah conscious but pale, his leg wrapped tight enough to slow the bleeding until the medical team could take over. Nobody spoke during the transport back to the station. There was nothing clean to say about an order that had worked exactly as intended and still felt like a betrayal every single second I had carried it out. Grace found me afterward in the corridor outside the medical wing, arms crossed, watching me with an expression that had stopped trying to hide what it actually was. "You gave the order Park would have given," she said. "Velkar would have given. Any of them." "I know. Doesn't make it sit right, does it?" I did not answer her, because there was no answer that would have made either of us feel better about it, and some things, I was learning, were never meant to be resolved cleanly. They were simply meant to be carried, the way Vrenkel's name had been carried, instead of erased into a designation, the way Ryan's box had been carried home too small and too quiet for anyone to properly explain. I found Mia Ashford in the medical wing an hour later, checking on Noah while he drifted in and out of a sedated half-sleep, his leg already stabilized under a regenerative wrap that the Compact's medical technology made look almost too easy. "He'll keep the leg," she said, before I had even asked. Another 20 minutes out there, and that wouldn't have been a guarantee. I know. You made the right call, Hartley. Doesn't feel like it. Mia set down the scanner in her hand and looked at me directly, the way Brooks had looked at Grace on that first night, the way Park had looked at me in the wreckage of the staging zone. Every steady gaze on this station beginning to blur together into one long, exhausted kind of understanding. It's not supposed to feel like it. The day a hard call starts feeling easy is the day you stop being someone worth following. Lucas and Grace found their way into the medical wing not long after, settling into the chairs around Noah's bed without anyone needing to suggest it. The four of us sitting in a loose, silent circle around a man who would have died on that ridge if the math had run even slightly differently. Nobody talked about the order. Nobody needed to. We simply stayed, the way we had stayed in the wreckage after the staging zone, the way Vrenkel's name had been carried instead of forgotten, and somewhere in that quiet, unremarkable hour, I understood that this, more than any rank Velkar had handed me, was the actual shape of command the Compact had never trained for and never would. The Compact had wanted obedient soldiers who followed orders without the weight of what those orders actually cost. What they had built instead, without meaning to, was a unit that followed those same orders while carrying every ounce of that weight anyway, refusing to let any of it go quiet. I did not know yet that the weight was about to get a great deal heavier, or that the battle waiting for us further down the Korathi front was about to test every last piece of what the Compact still did not understand about the soldiers they had taken from Earth. The fortress walls of Cathara Hold filled the entire horizon by the time our transport dropped low enough for visual confirmation, a structure the Compact's own intelligence reports had called functionally impossible to breach with the forces available to us. I had read that report twice on the flight in, and both times it had used the exact same word. Impossible. Funny word for a briefing, Lucas said beside me, checking his weapon for the third time in 10 minutes, a habit he had picked up since the staging zone that none of us had ever called out loud. Feels like the kind of word that should come with a backup plan. It does, I said. Us. Cathara Hold sat at the center of the Korathi supply network, a fortified junction that fed weapons and reinforcements to half the active front. Compact Command had spent 6 months planning a conventional assault against it, and abandoned every version of that plan once the casualty projections came back. The walls were too thick for orbital strikes without risking the surrounding terrain the Compact still needed intact. The approach routes were too narrow for the kind of armored push every other species doctrine relied on. By every rule the Compact had ever trained into its soldiers, Cathara Hold simply could not be taken. Nobody had ever built a rule for what human battalions actually were anymore, 6 months into a war that had stopped looking anything like the orientation briefings back on the station. We were not the only humans on that transport. 3 full battalions had been pulled together for the assault, soldiers who had spent the last half-year doing exactly what my own unit had been doing since the staging zone, breaking formation for each other, trading resources instead of hoarding them, building something closer to a single, sprawling family than anything the Compact's training architecture had ever intended to produce. Captain Brooks commanded the lead battalion. Vrenkel, recovered and reassigned as liaison officer to the human command structure after his own request, a request that had apparently taken considerable internal argument within Compact leadership, rode in the transport beside mine, watching the fortress grow larger through the viewport with an expression I had come to recognize as careful, controlled anticipation. Compact doctrine calls for a staged withdrawal if initial contact exceeds projected resistance, he said, not quite looking at me. I assume you will be ignoring that doctrine. Wouldn't be much of a battle plan if we didn't. I assumed as much. A faint, dry note crept into his translated voice, something I had learned to recognize as the closest thing to humor his species' vocal patterns could comfortably produce. I have stopped including the withdrawal clause in my own reports. It saves time. Mia Ashford rode further back in the same transport, kit checked and rechecked the way she always did before a drop, and she caught my eye across the rows of seated soldiers with the same steady, unbothered look she had given me in the wreckage of the staging zone months earlier. "You good?" she called over the noise of the engines. "Define good. Standing when this is over. Working on it." Grace sat beside Noah a few rows up, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder in the particular way it had since the reconnaissance mission. A small gesture neither of them ever bothered explaining, and nobody ever asked them to. Noah's leg had healed clean, no trace left of the wound that had nearly taken it, and he carried himself now with the quiet, settled confidence of a man who had stopped flinching at the sound of his own name being called across a battlefield. Lucas leaned his head back against the transport wall, eyes closed, looking for all the world like a man trying to nap his way through the end of the universe. "You're not actually sleeping," I said. Resting my eyes. Big difference. Very important distinction before a fortress assault that command itself called impossible. "You scared?" He opened one eye and looked at me, and for just a moment, the easy humor dropped away entirely, leaving something underneath it that I had only ever seen flicker across his face once or twice before, back on that first night in the barracks when none of us had known yet what we were actually walking into. "Every single time," he said, "doesn't stop me, just means I'm paying attention." He closed his eye again, and the moment passed the way most of our moments did, folded back into something lighter before it had the chance to settle too heavily on either of us. The plan, such as it was, had been built less around compact doctrine and more around the one thing 6 months of fighting had taught every human soldier on that transport. We did not need clean lines or predictable formations to win. We needed each other, moving fast and trusting completely, filling gaps the Karathi defense had never been built to anticipate because no force they had faced before had ever fought this way. The drop came hard and fast, 3 battalions hitting the outer perimeter from 5 separate directions at once, a pattern that made no sense on any tactical map until the fighting actually began, and the Karathi defenders found themselves stretched between threats that kept appearing in places their own doctrine said should have been empty. Grace and Noah led a breach team through the eastern gate, while Lucas and I pushed through a maintenance corridor too narrow for Karathi armor to follow, moving fast through smoke and noise that had stopped feeling foreign to either of us months ago. The fighting inside Kathara Hold was close and brutal, in a way the staging zone had only hinted at. Corridor after corridor of fortified position that should have ground our advance to a halt within the first hour. It did not, because every time one human unit stalled against resistance too heavy to push through alone, another unit found a way to flank it, to draw fire away, to fill a gap that should not have existed according to anyone's original battle plan. We were 3 hours into the assault, deep inside the fortress's central command structure, when the Karathi made their last real stand. A reinforced position blocked the corridor leading to the fortress's primary command core, heavy enough that 2 separate human squads had already been forced back from it, their advance stalling in a stretch of corridor with no cover and no clean angle of approach. Lucas and I arrived with what remained of our unit, just as a third assault was breaking apart under concentrated fire, soldiers pinned against walls that offered nothing close to adequate protection. "We need to draw their attention off that doorway," Lucas said, already scanning the corridor for an angle that did not exist. "Long enough for someone to get a charge against the position. That's a straight line into their kill zone." I know. Behind us, what remained of the 3rd squad pressed flat against the corridor wall, 2 of them wounded, all of them out of options that did not end with more of us pinned in the open. A Karathi heavy gun cycled somewhere beyond the doorway, the whine of it building toward another sustained burst that would chew through anyone careless enough to be standing in its path when it fired. The seconds we had to work with were already running out, measured less in any clock than in the rhythm of that weapon's charge cycle, climbing toward its next release. I looked at the angle Lucas had been studying and saw exactly what he saw, the same impossible math the rest of us had been staring at for the last 10 minutes. There was no clean path to that doorway. There had never been one. The only way through was someone willing to be the reason the rest of us survived long enough to find it. I looked at him, and he looked back at me with an expression I had seen exactly once before, in the wreckage of the staging zone, the same steady certainty that had carried him toward a wounded stranger, on a path the simulation had marked as compromised. "I'll go," he said. "You cover." "Lucas." "Somebody has to, Daniel. Might as well be the wall." He was moving before I could argue further, breaking from cover in a dead sprint across open ground that should never have offered a single second of survival, and I opened fire alongside everyone else who could see him, pouring everything we had into the reinforced position to buy him whatever fraction of time existed between him and the kill zone he was running straight into. He made it far enough. The charge went off seconds after he reached the position, and the corridor beyond it opened up entirely, the last real obstacle between our forces and the fortress's command core finally cleared. I will not describe what the corridor looked like after that. Some things do not need describing to be carried, and some costs are better measured in silence than in detail. I knelt in that corridor for exactly as long as the battle allowed me to, and then I stood, because the fighting was not finished, and because Lucas had bought us a path that someone still needed to walk. We took the command core 40 minutes later. Cathara Hold fell that night, the first major fortress along the Karathi supply network to fall to compact forces in over a year of fighting, and every official report filed afterward would describe it as a decisive tactical victory achieved through unconventional human battlefield doctrine. None of those reports would mention his name. I made sure my own report did, even knowing it would likely be filed away as sentiment rather than data, the same way every other detail about what made human soldiers actually function had been filed away since the staging zone. Some things, I had decided somewhere in that corridor, deserved to exist in a record somewhere, even if the record itself never fully understood why. There was no parade when we returned to the station, no grand ceremony, no medals pinned with the kind of fanfare the compact reserved for victories its own doctrine had predicted. There was only a quiet debrief, a long list of names that would not be making the return trip to Earth, and a silence among the surviving members of my unit that felt heavier than anything the fighting itself had managed to produce. Grace found me 3 days later in the same mess hall where Vren Kell had once asked me a question I had not fully known how to answer. She sat across from me without asking, the way she always had, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. "He'd have made a joke about this," she finally said, "about the silence, about all of us sitting here being too dramatic for our own good. Probably something about the food," I said. "Definitely something about the food." We sat with that for a while, the particular ache of missing a person's specific way of filling a silence, and somewhere underneath the grief, I felt the same old familiar anger rise up, sweet and steadying, the tool I had learned to reach for whenever the alternative felt like too much to carry all at once. I let it sit there without using it, for once, just to see if I could. I wrote to my mother that same week, the first real letter I had managed to put together since leaving Earth, longer than anything I had sent in the months before. I told her about the station, about the war, about people I had come to love in a place I had never chosen to be. I did not tell her everything Cathara Hold had cost, because some things did not survive translation onto paper any better than they survived translation through a Severine liaisons device. I told her Lucas's name, though, and a little of who he had been, because I had learned by then that names mattered more than almost anything else the compact had ever tried to measure. Vren Kell visited the barracks not long after, standing in the doorway with the particular stillness his species carried, even in moments that called for something softer. He did not say much. He rarely did, when words felt too small for the occasion. He simply set a small data drive on the table beside my bunk, containing, he told me later, the full record of the corridor assault, unedited, including a section the official compact report had quietly omitted. "I added his name to the formal record," he said. "It will likely be removed again. I will keep adding it back." I did not know what to say to that, so I simply nodded, and he nodded in return, and something passed between us that no training program back on that station could ever have predicted producing. 6 months after Cathara Hold, a new transport arrived at the station, carrying the next battalion of human soldiers pulled from Earth under the same debt-fueled contracts that had once put a needle in my own neck. I watched them disembark from the observation deck above the transport bay, 40 men and women in identical gray fatigues, blinking against unfamiliar light, wearing the same expression I knew I must have worn on that very first day, somewhere between fury and fear and a confusion that had nowhere yet to land. Captain Brooks found me watching them and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that the two of us had not already said to each other a dozen times over the past year. I was the one assigned to give them their orientation. I stood in front of that hall the following morning, 40 new faces watching me, with the same wary uncertainty Grace and Lucas and Noah had once worn in that same room, and I gave them the speech the compact had written for soldiers like them, the one about compliance ensuring survival, about following command without hesitation, about resistance ensuring termination of contract. I watched their faces while I said it, and I already knew, the way Director Velkar had never quite managed to know, that none of it would actually take. Somewhere in that hall stood a young woman who would break formation within the week to drag a wounded stranger out of a collapsed structure she had never been ordered to enter. Somewhere stood a young man who would give up his place in a supply line to a squad mate who needed it more, without anyone telling him to, the same way Lucas once had, the same way I once had, on a transport ship that had felt, on that very first day, like the end of everything I understood about my own life. The compact had wanted soldiers. They had no idea, even now, exactly what they kept getting instead. I finished the speech, and the hall stayed quiet for a moment longer than the script accounted for, the way it always did, the way it probably always would. Then I told them the truth instead. I told them that the orientation they had just heard was correct about exactly one thing, that compliance would, in the narrowest sense, keep them breathing a little longer than open defiance would. I told them everything after that was theirs to decide, and that whatever they decided, they would not be deciding it alone, because somewhere in that hall, without any of them realizing it yet, they had already found the people who would carry them through whatever came next. I told them about Grace, who had run toward danger in a training exercise before any of us understood why. I told them about Noah, steady and quiet, who had bled out half a war's worth of fear into covering fire that saved more lives than any official report would ever fully account for. I did not tell them everything about Lucas, because some things still did not fit easily into a speech meant for 40 strangers on their first day, but I told them his name, and I told them that the wall he had once joked about claiming for himself had turned out to be exactly the kind of wall this war actually needed. A young man near the front of the hall, barely out of his teens by the look of him, raised a hand the way the compact's training manual had taught nobody to do, because the manual had never expected questions in the first place. "Why are you telling us this?" he asked. "Isn't this supposed to be an orientation?" "It is," I said. "This is the part where I orient you toward what actually matters out here." He did not have a response for that, and neither did anyone else in that hall, and for a long moment, the silence held the way it had held in that same room a year and a half earlier, when none of us had known yet what we were walking into. I thought of Ryan then, of a box too small and too quiet, of a word, combat failure, that had never once explained anything that actually mattered. I thought of a needle in my neck, of a planet shrinking behind black glass, of a journey I had never agreed to take. I looked out at 40 strangers wearing the same fear I had once worn, and somewhere underneath that fear, the same thing the compact had never managed to measure, train, or fully understand. The compact had wanted soldiers from Earth. Instead, they got us.